Welcome, everyone. We are so happy you can join us today. It is my pleasure to be with you. I am Kim Hollander, the Executive Director of the Oxalosis and Hyperoxaluria Foundation, better known as OHF. Today's webinar, What We Are and What We Are Doing for PH1, PH2, and PH3, will be presented by Dicerna Pharmaceuticals. We want you to remind you that this webinar is being provided for informational purposes only. We urge you to please consult with your doctor or physician if you have any medical questions or concerns. Change slide. OHF Connect is an interactive educational resource where patients and caregivers can ask questions and obtain answers from our industry partners. On behalf of the entire OHF community, we want to thank Dicerna Pharmaceuticals for being a partner in OHF Connect. Change slide. Before we begin, I wanted to let you know that this webinar should last about an hour. Although your line will be muted during today's live stream, you will be able to submit your questions in the form below the presentation. The webinar will be available for on-demand viewing at the same link and on the OHF YouTube channel, which you can access at any time. It is with great pleasure that I introduce to you Dave Caponera, Head of Patient Advocacy and Patient Services at Dicerna Pharmaceuticals.
Hello, everybody. First, let me thank OHF for allowing us to participate in the Connect program and you for clicking on to listen to our webinar. We're excited to introduce Dicerna to those who may not know us and to continue our acquaintance with those who do. Let me introduce myself. As Kim said, I am head of the Patient Advocacy and Patient Services program at Dicerna. What does that mean? It means I work closely with the patient organizations such as OHF, excuse me, and the EUPH Patient Advocacy Group, as well as others. I have worked with a variety of rare diseases in the last 22 years in the biotechnology field. I'm also a registered respiratory therapist and have worked clinically at several hospitals regarding the respiratory therapy. My colleague, Dr. Carrie Russell, is head of late-stage clinical development, which means she works intimately with disease experts to develop clinical studies. Carrie received her Doctor of Medicine degree from the University of Texas and MD Anderson Cancer Center, completed internships and fellowships at Yale University Medical School, where she was on the faculty for over a decade, and has worked at several biotechnology companies before joining Dicerna this year in 2020. Next slide, please. These are the objectives we are hoping you will achieve today in understanding Dicerna and what we are doing for PH. We encourage you to submit your questions directly to the OHF, who will ask the question on your behalf. Next slide, please. Our purpose, as you can see, is that we do strive to deliver life-changing therapies to meet the very urgent needs of people living with severe genetic diseases. We do focus on RNAi interference technology, which Carrie will review in a moment. This technology is very selective in its ability to silence the genes that are causing the disease. Some facts about Dicerna are shown on this slide. We are located in Lexington, Massachusetts, but work with disease experts around the globe. For more information about us, check out our website at dicerna.com. And now, Carrie will explain RNAi and what we are doing for PH. Next slide, please.
Thanks, Dave. I hope that I can share with you a brief overview of how RNA interference or RNAi technology works. Next slide. So inside of cells, the nucleus is a storage vault for DNA. DNA carries the recipes for all the proteins that carry out functions in the body. mRNA, shown here in the nucleus, is the carrier of these recipes to the machinery in the cytoplasm where the recipe is translated into a protein. RNA interference is a new technology, And it capitalizes on something that's actually a built-in mechanism in cells. Cells contain this machinery, which includes Dicer, from which we get part of our company name. And this mechanism actually allows the cell to regulate how much of the mRNA is made into protein. So it's an endogenous cellular process. And at Dicerna, we create our own special forms of RNAi that can selectively shut off translation of an unwanted protein that may be contributing to a disease like primary hyperoxaluria, or PH. Next slide, please. Our scientists chose to turn down translation of a protein called lactate dehydrogenase A, or LDHA. This protein performs a critical function as a key last step for formation of oxalate. Too much oxalate, as you all know, is the main driver for formation of calcium oxalate and kidney stones. By turning down LDHA, we can block the production of oxalate, thus potentially offering benefit to all patients with genetic forms of PH. By contrast, RNAi therapeutics that block only one of the proteins in this pathway, for example, seen here in the upper left-hand part of this panel, GO, can only treat forms of PH associated with excessive oxalate formed through that specific genetic mechanism. So, for example, blocking GO will treat PH1, but will not treat PH2 or PH3. Next slide, please. Some patients with PH do not carry mutations that define them as subtypes 1, 2, or 3. Because the mechanisms causing PH in such patients has not yet been discovered, we do not know whether nedosiran, the RNAi therapeutic that we are developing, will help them. Therefore, it's critical that patients undergo appropriate genetic testing to determine which type of PH they may have. As you know, genetic testing can be expensive. So to help with this, Dicerna is offering no-cost genetic testing to eligible patients. In this genetic testing, a PH panel, or nephrolithiasis genetic testing panel, will be provided both in the US and globally. 3 types of specimens can be collected depending on the particular lab and particular location. These could include either a cheek swab, a whole blood draw, or contribution of a small dried blood spot on a cardboard card. We have protocols and procedures in place during the COVID-19 crisis. So for example, patients in the US have the option of conducting this test at home or in a healthcare professional's office. If your physician believes you may have PH and would benefit from this test, please have them contact Michelle Glover, who is our Senior Medical Science Liaison and Lead Diagnostic Specialist. You'll find her contact information here below. Next slide, please. Next, I'd like to give you a brief overview of the comprehensive panel of studies that Dicerna is conducting in order to make nedosiran as broadly applicable to patients with PH as possible. Next slide, please. PH affects people of all ages, genders, and ethnicities, and can lead to severe kidney malfunction, even kidney failure. So in order to ensure that nedosiran is safe and effective in all these people, we've carried out a large variety of clinical studies, including our first study, PHYOX1, shown at the top of this slide, which was a single ascending dose study of nedosiran in healthy volunteers first, and then in patients with PH1 and PH2. This study has already concluded. Again, it was a single dose study, but those patients have been allowed to continue into our PHYOX3 program, which is a longer term study looking at outcomes including renal function with monthly dosing of nedosiran in these patients. It's important to note, PHYOX3 is what we call an open label study. This means everyone gets active nedosiran. There is no placebo group in that study. And that will be important when you consider the next studies that I'm going to describe. Our next study, which is ongoing, is our specific registration study. That means this is going to provide the main data that we will submit to health authorities such as the FDA in order to make nedosiran a real drug. This is a double-blind, placebo-controlled trial, and I will describe it in a bit more detail in a moment. Currently, this study is enrolling patients with PH1 and PH2 and includes patients down to the age of 6. Our next study that I want to talk about is PHYOX7. You can see that down here towards the bottom of the slide. In this study, we will do an open label study to understand whether nedosiran is safe and efficacious in patients with end-stage renal disease. And this particular study is the one out of here, of all of these studies, which will include PH patients who are already on dialysis. And then I want to talk a little bit more, especially at the end of this discussion, about PH3. We have several studies that are going to help us to understand whether nedosiran is helpful and safe in patients who have PH3. The first of these will be the PHYOX4 study, which will open very soon. This is, again, a double-blind, placebo-controlled study, patients with PH3 only. I'll describe in a moment a little more detail. And then a natural history study, trying to understand exactly how PH3 manifests in patients. And we'll get to that also in a moment. So next slide, please. So PHYOX2, again, our registrational study, is the key study that will present to gain approval for nedosiran to be prescribed to patients with PH1 and PH2. It is a placebo-controlled study where patients will be randomly assigned to nedosiran or placebo injection. However, it's important to note that twice as many patients will receive nedosiran as those who receive placebo. But neither the patient nor the physician will know which group the patient is in. This is important because we need to be able to provide non-biased information about the safety and efficacy of the drug to ensure that it works the way that we believe it will. In the study, nedosiran is given as a monthly injection for 6 months. The key way we determine whether nedosiran is doing its job is by measuring how much oxalate is being filtered by the kidney into the urine. We and others, including PH specialty physicians, believe that if we can prove that we've reduced oxalate levels in the kidney by showing reduced oxalate in the urine, that we will prevent damage to the kidney that can sometimes lead to kidney malfunction or kidney failure. Next slide, please. Now we'll discuss the studies that are upcoming for patients who have the specific genetic phenotype of PH3. Next slide, please. So what about PH3? PH3 is probably the least well understood form of genetically defined PH. And even though out of all the patients diagnosed with PH, only 10% have PH3, genetic population studies suggest that the true percentage of PH patients who have PH3 could be as high as 50%. So why is that? So this discrepancy arises because patients who have had recurrent kidney stones as infants or young children never get phenotyped, and therefore they're not properly diagnosed as having PH3. In addition, the progression to severe kidney malfunction is less predictable in these patients. So we're engaged in 2 important studies that will test the following 2 questions. 1, whether nedosiran will lower oxalate levels in patients with PH3, as we predict it will. And 2, whether urine levels of oxalate will predict production of kidney stones or kidney injury and malfunction. And I'll describe those 2 studies next. Next slide, please. The first of these studies, which I mentioned a few moments ago, is PHYOX4. This will also be a placebo-controlled study where twice as many patients will receive nedosiran as placebo. Patients will be given 1 dose of nedosiran or placebo and will test whether nedosiran can decrease levels of oxalate in the urine. After participation in PHYOX4 and with approval of their physician, all patients will be eligible to enroll in PHYOX3, where they can continue to receive monthly nedosiran. Again, there's no placebo group in that particular study for up to an additional 3 years. Next slide, please. In addition to this study, we're also enrolling patients over the age of 2 in an observational, and what that means is we're not going to be giving any particular drug, study called Phiox-OBX. In this study, we will follow urinary levels of oxalate and see whether higher oxalate levels correlate with the production of kidney stones or with ongoing kidney injury and malfunction. This is a very important study that may open new doors to disease understanding and treatment for patients with PH3. We hope this study, in conjunction with Phiox4, will help us to understand whether nedosiran can help PH patients in the same way that we believe it will help PH1 and PH2 patients. Next slide. So what's involved if you want to become a patient in the Phiox observational study? If you or someone you know has PH3, we encourage participation in this registry study. It's fairly non-invasive. We are establishing sites all around the world, as we have for all of our studies. Travel costs can be provided, as for all of our studies, in case participants do not live near a site. Over the 2 years of the study, only 5 physical visits are required to the site. The reason that those visits are required is because blood work will be performed, a non-invasive kidney ultrasound to look for stones and calcification in the kidney will be performed, and we'll collect information about how PH3 is impacting the patient's daily life. We will also be collecting urine, and specific information for that collection will be given at the time of screening. One additional scheduled phone call will be made after screening to let patients know that they qualify or are enrolled. We thank our future PH3 patients for donating their valuable time and information to help the PH community to increase awareness and knowledge about this important form of PH. And we hope the information to be gathered in this study will lead to new treatments for patients that will improve their quality of life. Next slide, please.
Thanks, Carrie. Appreciate all the information. Please don't hesitate to gather more information either via the websites shown below or to contact Carrie or myself. Thanks again to the OHF. Don't forget about the OHF FDA patient voice meeting. It's a virtual meeting on October 5th. And now Kim Hollander with the OHF will provide us with some of your questions.
Thanks so much, Dave and Carrie. This was an excellent overview of what's happening at Dicerna. It is so incredibly exciting, and I know our patients are flooding my email right now, asking a lot of questions. So this is really incredible, and we're so enthusiastic about things that are happening in the community, and want to thank the entire Dicerna team for making it possible. We're in very hopeful times, and this is extremely encouraging. So thank you. So the first question that we received, I think this is going to go to Dr. Carey. So the person asked if patients in countries outside of the US are desperate to get into clinical studies. If there's no clinic location near them, can they be considered for clinical trials in the US?
That's a really good question. As I mentioned, we do have sites all around the world, almost many places I think you might not expect. So I think the first step is to please contact us. We'll try to set you up with a site that's close to home. If that's not possible, we have worked very hard in all of our other studies to be able to provide travel costs to patients, obviously within reason and something that would be comfortable for you as well. So please reach out. We do want to enroll you, and we will work hard to achieve that.
Great, thank you. I also wanted to let you know, if you're watching the webinar, please remember at the bottom of your screen, you can immediately type into that form and we'll receive your question live. So we encourage you to ask as many questions as you would like. If we don't get to answer all the questions today, don't worry, we'll follow up in an email. So please start sending questions. Okay, so a next question. When do you believe you will get FDA approval for this medicine? And Dave, maybe this is more in your wheelhouse.
Sure. Thanks, Kim. Yes, we're working to really complete our studies and also complete all the regulatory requirements to get a therapy to patients as soon as possible. So we're working really hard to get this done as soon as we can.
Great. Okay, and another question just rolled in. What is your research with pH2 and pH3? Is it different than pH1?
So we presented for our R&D day some data from our 301 open label study showing very promising results in pH1. At this point, we have only a very few number of pH2 patients in that study, so the data is a bit inconclusive. But mechanistically and based on the preclinical data that we've obtained in animal models, we have pretty strong faith that this is going to work the same in pH2 as pH1, and similarly in pH3. But the only way for us to determine that is, unfortunately, for us to test it in the patients where it needs to go. So this is the reason we're so grateful, for people donating of themselves so that we can do the best we can to make sure the drug is safe and efficacious in every form of pH.
Wonderful, thank you. Next question. Why hasn't there been more information on pH3?
That's an excellent question. And I must tell you, I think what Dave left out is that I'm a cardiologist. But I've been working hard, trying to be in touch with the people who are seeing these patients every day. And I've learned some really interesting things about, what people's concept of this particular form of pH was and what perhaps the reality of it is. And sometimes it takes decades of following a patient before you really learn what the full impact of that is on the patient. And at this point, I think we just haven't had enough individual physicians who've seen enough of these patients to really know that. But that information is forthcoming. A lot of people have dedicated their entire careers to this, and many of them are the folks that are helping us to run our clinical trials. So, for that reason, we think that this observational study may really help us get a closer handle on that. We don't have the kind of detailed information that we're going to gather in that study, like serial kidney ultrasounds. And so these are all the pieces of that puzzle that we need to really sort out, how to best help patients.
Great. And we just had another question that I think is extremely relevant, Carrie. So to your point on the pH3 observational study, how do patients enroll in that? And I think that's going to be really interesting for patients because it's observational. So there's no poking or prodding, but this is going to help really lay that groundwork that you're talking about, where there's a potential need for more information to better understand our patients with pH3.
There is one little poke, though, because there is a blood test, but just a little one.
There is a blood test.
Yeah.
Yes, there are a few blood tests, including getting the genotyping as well.
Right.
Can be done with a blood test. So.
And so how do
very little other poking and prodding and no actual medication at this point. But it's the kind of thing that could get us to the point where we'd be ready to treat pH3 patients very quickly, once the drug is approved.
And if a patient was interested in enrolling, how did they go about doing that?
So on the last slide that you saw, our contact information is there, as well as a couple of the websites where the study is registered. In the US, it will go up at clinicaltrials.gov, where most trials are registered. And I've been told that should happen any day now, so keep an eye out for that. And that will also have contact information. But in the meantime, please feel free to reach out to Dave or I.
Yeah, and to your point, it also will be listed on OHF.org. So you'll be able to easily find that, as well as all the clinical trials. Okay, so next question. Let's see, there's so many. If I enroll in a clinical trial, how often will I have to be injected with nonacerin?
Yes, so we've done extensive research to determine what the optimal dose and frequency of that drug is. It's actually, the science behind it's actually really quite impressive as a kind of a newcomer to Dicerna. And right now we believe the optimal dosing period is monthly. So all of our studies now include monthly doses. It's possible that we could extend the timing between that, but we actually see the best results with that. So that's why we're sticking with the monthly dosing.
Okay. What kind of side effects do RNAi drugs have?
That's a really good question. These drugs, especially the newest generation that Dicerna is working with, have been found to be extremely safe and well tolerated. some patients get a small skin reaction, but in most patients, it's very short-lived and very mild. And in fact, in our studies, we've never found a patient who had to stop treatment because of that side effect. Other side effects that people had theoretical concerns about included liver and muscle effects, but we've done a lot of preclinical studies looking at that, and we've never found any significant liver or muscle effects in any of our patients either. So we are carefully monitoring for that. Things look good so far.
And Terry, part of that is this is a very targeted therapy, right?
Yes, it's targeted specifically to the liver. And I don't want to go into a lot of details, but suffice it to say that there are actually people who have this protein, the LDHA, completely absent in their bodies, and they really have no liver side effects. They have some muscle fatigue when they exercise, but that's because of the loss in the muscle. And our drug, we believe, does not target this protein in the muscle.
Okay, great. Thank you. That's really informative. I think we have time for maybe 2 more questions. And this is our first COVID question. What if I can't make it to the site for a visit because of COVID restrictions?
So our operational team has done an amazing job of working around this terrible pandemic situation. And suffice it to say, we've managed to keep our studies going throughout this. And that's been done by arranging home visits as frequently as possible. We've built that into all of our future studies. Although at this point, I don't think we can do kidney ultrasounds from the home, but we can definitely be very flexible, you know, and we've worked really hard to try to accomplish not losing time to get this valuable therapeutic through. So we'll work with you. And I also wanted to mention another good place for getting information is at medicalinfo@dicerna.com. And I believe that was on one of our slides as well, as far as entry into clinical trials.
Great. And for our last question of the day, does a patient's dose ever change if their oxalate levels don't decrease? And how do you determine a dose?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And at this, yeah, we've done a lot of studies looking at the dose range of nedosiran and the response of oxalate. And we are not currently dose adjusting based on urinary oxalate. There are dose adjustments made in younger children. We've just recently determined the dose for 6 to 11-year-olds and are enrolling those patients in some of our studies. We will be, from that information, determining a dose for the youngest of our patients. So we will get all the way down to birth eventually with some of our studies. But it's not going to be dose adjusted based on urinary oxalate because the variability in that measurement can be quite significant. So yeah, it's a great idea, and we've looked at that. It doesn't look like that's something that will add additional benefit over the strategy that we've already started.
Well, this has been incredibly insightful, and I can't thank the 2 of you from the bottom of my heart, and for all the patients and caregivers out there around the globe. My emails were flooded from people from all over the world just now. And if we didn't get to your question, don't worry, we'll follow up with emails. I want to let you know that this questionnaire will remain open for 30 days. So if you have questions, morning, night, we're available, and we'll make sure we get a response to you. We want to thank again the Dicerna team and everyone that is just trying to create treatments to help our patient community. We desperately need partners in this, and we're so happy and thankful to have Dicerna as a partner. So again, we thank you, and thanks to you, our patients and families, for joining today. Please share this on your Facebook page, on your YouTube channel, so we really can get the word out about treatments and possible treatments for primary hyperoxaluria. Again, thank you again on behalf of OHF, and we appreciate it. Stay safe, everyone.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Kim. Bye.
Bye.